So this chapter, like the last, has quite a bit to look at, to think about, and cover. We're not going to cover every question in the study guide. Some of them are just good for us to reflect on. But before we dive in for today, I want to review just briefly some of the things we've been covering as we've been thinking about the role of husbands. First, a couple weeks back, we looked at the question of the what. What is the role God has given to husbands? And we learned that according to the Bible, the husband is called to be the head of the home, even as Christ is the head of the church. And that headship is to be modeled after the holy headship of Jesus Christ, which means it is a role of servant leadership and self-sacrifice, not a role of self-service. The husband is not in charge in a way that he is free to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. He is in charge in such a way that God holds him responsible for carefully loving, guiding, and serving the needs of his family as best as he is able. So there's the what question, servant leadership that is sacrificial and modeled after Jesus. And then we looked at the why question. Why has God set it up this way? And last week we looked at two particular things. We saw that the purpose of the husband's role as head was not to tear down his wife and children if he has them, or to trample on them or dominate them, but rather to build them up in the Lord and to model Christ to his family. We also saw, secondly, not only that the husband's headship role is to build up the wife and to strengthen her, but also that it has a blessing to himself, doesn't it? God uses this responsibility, this calling and role for husbands to actually help grow and mature them in their faith. And if you've ever had any responsibility put upon you in life, I'm sure that you've found that to be true. When much is asked of you, typically more is brought out of you. You're able to rise to that occasion, at least at some level. And so being called to such a big role actually helps us grow up in the faith and learn to follow Christ in a more holy way. So we've looked at the what, we've looked at the why. This week we're looking at the question of how. How are husbands supposed to go about faithfully living up to this calling? And so that'll lead us right to page 15 of our study guide, where I've got a little bit of an introduction for us to work our way through. If you would, jump down with me to the paragraph that begins with, many husbands would be willing. Many husbands would be willing. I'm going to start reading right there. Many husbands would be willing to lay down their life for their family in a dramatic emergency situation. They would defend their family as best as they are able, even if that meant their own suffering and death. But sadly, in contrast, there are very few husbands who are willing to lay down their life for their family in the ordinary ebb and flow of daily life, where the call to selfless sacrifice matters most. As Karen Howe once quipped, most women do not want their men to die for them. They want their men to live for them. And you can get her tongue-in-cheek comment there, right? She's saying, this great grand idea about laying down your life, that's all wonderful, but it means actually living for me and actually caring about me and putting me first today. And I think we can relate to that sentiment. Next paragraph, the aim of this chapter is to reawaken men's eyes to the full scope of what it means to truly be a selfless leader in the marriage and family. The call to self-sacrifice certainly includes the desperate situations that may come, but it also means being a selfless leader in the midst of the mundane moments of everyday life. It means changing diapers and doing dishes, rubbing your wife's back and helping the kids brush their teeth. It means that the world does not revolve around your work schedule and your interests, but rather you do your best to make those things conform to the needs of your family. As we continue to hold up Jesus Christ as our ultimate example of the husband that we are called to be, we will look at several characteristics that should mark the way we love, serve, and sacrifice for our families as the head of the home. One major question we will be considering is this: how are men to faithfully exercise headship in the midst of daily life together as a family? Before we dive in, I want to share just briefly an illustration that just happened about an hour ago at my house. I was looking over my notes to lead this discussion this afternoon, and I get a call coming through my headphones because I put them on to kind of drown out a little bit of the noise. And that call was that some help was needed in the bathroom. And our 2-year-old, who's just barely beginning to learn to be potty trained, had a little accident, and her hands were not in the best condition. And I was literally contemplating the very things that we're about to go through as I was doing this. I thought to myself, yeah, that's pretty much it. Like, I've got a decision right now, right? Am I going to be the kind of guy who says, like, someone else? Or am I going to be the kind of guy who can say, that's my daughter, I'm going to step up and serve? Obviously, we have different situations and circumstances, but you can see how real this really is in the fabric of daily life as we seek to love one another in our families. So let's look at page 16 and begin to work through. Throughout this chapter, there are several headings of the way or the how that husbands are called to love their wives. The first one is we're to love with self-sacrifice. And on page 68 and 69, the author provided an illustration from the life of former seminary president Robertson McQuilkin. What did McQuilkin do that was so memorable, and why did the author believe this was an example that you and I needed to hear? What happened in this story?
He sacrificed his position for the sake of his wife.
Yeah. His wife had aged. I'll bail some of you out who didn't do the reading. The man's wife, they were both getting older, and she had developed Alzheimer's. And long story short, she just needed care. And he was in a great position. He loved what he was doing. He enjoyed his role, but he was willing to give up what he loved, what gave him pleasure, what gave him satisfaction, to keep his vows to the one he had promised to serve with self-sacrificing love. And I think that is a great practical example. That would not be an easy decision to make, would it? I mean, put yourself in that position, giving up what you love to go home and take care of someone who's incapacitated, really, to return that love any longer in any kind of a meaningful way. I think that's a very beautiful picture for our contemplation. So next, yes?
Just an observation of that too, because it seems that he wasn't sensitive to her needs at the time. When she kept walking back and forth to the church again, it became pretty obvious.
Yes. Yes. The bloody feet made it clear, didn't it?
Hopefully we can see that before the events.
Yeah, very good insight. So what made McQuilkin's actions selfless? How would you put it? Yeah, Ken.
So I've got two things. Number one, the guy was at the peak of his career, and of course he had to give that up. But the other part is, and I think what many of the people in the world would have done is they could have hired a nurse to stay with the wife. You know, he could have justified not giving up his career by saying, hey, I'm able to hire somebody else.
Yeah, good observations. Yeah. Other insights? Yeah, Jordan.
I think also, he was doing work in seminary. He was doing powerful work, and also could have used that as an excuse to say, like, damn, a lot of people need what I'm giving them right now.
Mm-hmm.
But he realized that the true godly work was to help one person.
Yeah, I actually had that same thing scribbled in my notes as well, was that it would be easy to justify him not doing this based on the fact that he's doing, ministry work. Yeah. So husbands, now we turn it to you, right? The author set this forward as an example, not just to you, also to myself. But where in your marriage do you need to renew your commitment to love your wife with selfless sacrifice for her good? Have you thought about that question? Are there any areas in your life where this kind of thing is needed? Now, of course, so there's something extreme about McQuilkin's situation, but there's not something unique about it in the sense that there are things that our spouses need from us. And the question is, are you paying attention to them? And are you willing to set aside some of your own enjoyments and preferences in order to put them first? Let's press into the second one here. So not only the how question, how are husbands meant to lead, not only with self-sacrifice, but also by godly service. When we think about headship, what headship means, we often use succinct phrases to define it. And the author talks a little bit about this on page 69 and 70. And to be perfectly honest, I just don't think I can put it better than he has in the book. So I'm just going to read straight from that book if you want to join me on page 69. Or you can just listen as I read through this section, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. A Christian has the biblical responsibility to set the spiritual standards through which God will govern the family. What kind of authority is this? There is no quick way of saying it. Too often, Christians try to summarize male headship in the home by simply saying that the husband has, quote, the last word, or is the final authority in decision-making. Be glad this abbreviation of responsibilities is not found in the phrases of Scripture, because it can cause great damage. Such phraseology could mean that even if the wife, and then he gives several examples, even if the wife hates the idea of moving to a distant town, or doesn't want a particular home, or thinks a child does not need another after-school activity, or doesn't like a certain kind of lovemaking, or disagrees with the husband's method of disciplining children, or believes an investment is unwise, given all these examples, according to these shorthand definitions, the husband automatically gets his wishes because he is the, quote, head of the home and has the final word. Such a concept does not exist in the Bible. While the husband may need to exercise final authority, he has no right to express it without consideration of his family's concerns. The Bible takes care to direct a Christian man to use his authority for the benefit of his spouse and family. Biblical headship shifts the focus of husbanding from taking charge to taking responsibility. Being a godly husband is not so much asserting one's will as submitting one's prerogatives to the good of another. I want to contrast these two phrases that the author uses, taking charge versus taking responsibility. What does it mean to take charge in the usage here? What is he getting at by contrasting these? Okay, yeah. Making a decision, okay? Yes, and that's actually the language he uses, right, in that last sentence. Being a godly husband is not so much asserting one's will. I think that's kind of what he's getting at here, is taking charge would just mean asserting your own will or forcing others to do things your way. And he's saying that's the wrong way of thinking about headship. Now, does that mean there is never a time where a husband might need to say, honey, I know you do not like this plan, but I do believe this is the right and necessary step for us? Of course there's times where that may be. But even in that moment, he's not taking charge in that sort of self-asserting way. He's still doing that decision more as a taking responsibility, which is the second side. What does taking responsibility mean? How might we explain that? Okay, yeah, being accountable. Yeah, I like the way you put that. Being accountable, bearing the burden of the family. The author used the words submitting one's prerogatives to the good of another. In my own words, I would say using your authority to bless and to serve and to build up, rather than being inwardly focused in how you would use it. And you can see the contrast there, right? One is the taking charge is about yourself. It's doing what you want, the way you want it. And the other is using your authority to really contemplate how can I best protect, how can I best lead, how can I best serve all those who God has entrusted to my leadership? How can I make the decisions and have actions in my life that actually bless them and build them up? So, next part of our question here on the bottom of page 16 of the study guide, husbands, which of the two perspectives above best describes your exercise of headship? Yeah, thanks for being honest about that.
There's probably a dual role there as well. I will assert my will if we're doing something that I have much more expertise in. I'll try to do it nicely, And then I realized I've overstepped my bounds, and the responsibility part comes in.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe a good question that's a little less personal, but still getting after this for men to think about is, how can you cultivate an attitude of taking responsibility? Particular situations are going to come and they're going to go, and sometimes it may be a one-off. And so kind of, that's sort of like playing whack-a-mole, but what if this was just the way you were thinking about your role? Like that you were constantly thinking, okay, how can I use this role that God has given me to bless and to serve? Cultivating that attitude and perspective. What do you think might help you cultivate that? Like, what are some practical steps you can take to think about that? How so?
If you know something needs to be done,
Yeah, don't put it off, right?
instead of waiting for your wife to tell you 14 times, do it. Not that Jennifer ever would.
Yeah. Yeah, and what about on your way home from work? What if you actually took some time to stop and go, okay, I've been in go mode. Maybe I've even needed to be in something of an assertive mode, if depending on your work and what you're doing. Your mindset at work is obviously different than your mindset in relating to your spouse. But if we never make a change, if we never sort of, okay, I'm not at work anymore, now I'm talking to my best friend whom I love, if we don't make that change, bad things can happen, right? So maybe on your way home, you would cultivate a practice of taking, even if it's just 5 minutes or 2 minutes, to stop and pray for your spouse and stop and ask the Lord, Lord, I'm heading home from work. Help me to go in the doors ready to love and serve my family, rather than to be focused in on myself. Or even especially on hard days, right? When you're just feeling like, man, I don't have much left to give. All the more do you need to ask God, help me right now, Lord. I'm tempted to be just focused on myself and to shut down. But I know that's not what would honor you. Would you help me, Lord? Those kind of practices can be really helpful for cultivating a new normal, so to speak, a new normal perspective and outlook about your life. Flip with me over to the next one. So not only by, how do we do this? Not only by self-sacrifice and godly service, but also by leading by godly nurture. Paul, please, let's go back.
For some reason, I think it's very important to pray before you get home, but I think there's something bigger, and that is cultivating a home that you want to go to. Our home is my oasis away from work.
Mm.
The last thing I want to do is bring work through the front door. Now, things happen in the day. She might be able to see the tension or the stress, and we work together, so every once in a while I'll come home and she'll say, by the way, this happened, and I just kind of look up and go, please, I've had enough already. But I love coming home, and she has made it an environment that I want to be in.
Yeah.
And I have some of that job responsibility to do.
Mm-hmm.
But she's really created the household for us. It helps me a lot.
Yeah, and coming at that, just to take a quick tangent, because I think it's really helpful. There's that phrase that I think we've all heard, you've made your bed, now you have to, you're right? Okay, well that can be very negative, and I'm not necessarily trying to be overly negative, but the reality is that sometimes the very things we're complaining about in our marriages, we're responsible for producing. You don't like the way things are, but they're that way because of your own neglect or your own bad attitude or your own bitterness or your own complaining. Or, if you keep treating your spouse poorly and then suddenly your friendship between each other is struggling, it's kind of like, well, duh. Like, what did you think would happen? So we also have to consider, as you said, protecting that and making sure that we're prioritizing our home and our relationships and not letting bitterness and stress of life and all those other things have a place they shouldn't have. Does that make sense? Awesome. Good insight there. Top of 17, leading by godly nurture. I've got a couple of notes for us to read through here. According to Ephesians 5:29, husbands are called to both nourish and cherish their bride. While these words are closely linked, they also have important differences. To nourish means to help something grow and develop toward maturity. This refers to the husband's calling to help cultivate his wife's spiritual flourishing. To cherish means to tenderly love, care for, and defend. This refers to the husband's calling to treasure his wife with tender affection and keep her from harm. That includes spiritual harm, emotional harm, physical harm. Question 3 begins with a quote. As Christ gave himself to enable our spiritual growth, a husband has the responsibility of fostering spiritual growth in his wife. A husband should encourage his wife to develop her gifts and talents to bring maximum glory to God. Husbands, how are you presently loving your wife in this way? How are you intentionally using your headship to promote your wife's spiritual flourishing? What might you share? And maybe you start with, I'm not. And then suddenly I realize I should be. And that's okay. That's part of why a class like this can be helpful, is there are many blind spots that all of us have, including this guy right here. And so talking through some of these things helps us begin to realize, wow, there's this whole sector of my marriage that I've not even been thinking about that is really important and biblical. Wayne, I think you had something to share. Okay, yeah, so it's just setting a good godly example in your own conduct in life. Yeah. Actually, I thought that you were for a minute. Just kidding. Within an inch. What does this look like? How can we do this? Yeah, so identifying those things and actually calling them out in her and praising her for some of those things. Yeah, that's good. What else?
I think one of the things Jennifer really much enjoys and has enjoyed for years is kind of being able to go, have a freedom to go to Bible study.
Yeah.
And being able to come home, let her go, not to worry about dinner, okay, forget the kids, those kind of things. Just give her the freedom to do that so that she grows spiritually in that knowledge.
That's a great example, and I love that you brought out, even though your kids are grown now, but I love that you brought out. Well, but years back, I mean, your kids started small like all the others, but you brought out something. So what would it take? Like, for instance, if your wife is going to go to a midweek Bible study or something like that, a fellowship event or any of the sort of the above, you have to ask the question, what does it take for that to happen? And if you are like me, embarrassingly, there have been a number of times that I have, not with my words necessarily, but with my lack of help and my lack of thoughtfulness and planning, I've almost made my wife feel as though it's a burden for her to go do those kinds of things. Oh, now I've got to do this or that thing. And do you see my point? That is the antithesis of what we're talking about here. Rather than nourishing her faith and building her up, instead, what I was actually doing is kind of stifling her and not equipping her, keeping her back from making progress and receiving things that would build her up in the faith. So, husbands, we have to actually go, okay, most of us in the room, I think, would all go, do you like the idea of your wife growing spiritually? We'd all go, yes. Okay, well, what does that actually take for you? Does that mean that you're going to watch the children or that you're going to take care of dinner or you're going to take some things off of her plate that week so she has the freedom to do it? And fill in the blank. The specifics are going to look different for each of our families and dynamics and marriages, but the concept is the same. And that's what we're trying to get after here, is having a mindset to actually nourish the faith of our spouse, to do all that we can to equip them and help them. I'll give you an example from my life. I already gave you a negative one. I'll give you a positive one as well. My wife has a harder time getting up early in the morning. She doesn't sleep in super late, but she's not a morning riser. We're the opposite. I wake up easy in the morning. I'm alert and ready to go. But then at night, I'm pretty much no good. I'm tired after like 8:30, 9 o'clock. I'm pretty much done. And she's ready to go until midnight or so if she wanted to. So how do we help each other? Well, the reality is that late night quiet time and spending time with the Lord, just even for her, is not usually the most advantageous time. The beginning of the day really works out best. So how do I help her? She has asked me, and I've encouraged her very gently, honey, how about this is the time that I'll wake you up? Does that seem reasonable for you? Not some overzealous expectation that doesn't take into account her personality, but a realistic expectation. You know, the other thing is that not all the time, but often I'll try to prepare some coffee for her or things like that. And then do you know the next thing I need to do? Someone's got to look after the little guys. And so what needs to happen? Here's how this goes in our home. I get up way before her, and I've already done my entire time so that when now it's her turn, I'm actually there to create that space for her. Does that make sense? Again, it doesn't have to look the same in every person's situation, but the concept is the same. The idea of how do we actually love each other like this, and husbands especially taking the chief role in nourishing the faith of their spouse. Wives, now's your chance. How do you want your husbands to do this? What would it look like for your husbands to help in this way? Don't be nervous. We all want to hear. What are some examples of how we can support you? And honestly, your example is probably going to be helpful for all of us to hear because there's going to be some overlap and similarities. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so if you couldn't hear what Katrina is pointing out is conversations. Just she wants Jamie to say, "Hey, how was your time in the Word today? How was your prayer time today? What are you learning right now?" She wants for him to start those conversations so that they can process and dialogue together. That's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful example. What are some others? Yeah. Yeah, so being an active listener and communicating. So when you shared with me right now, what I heard you say was, just kidding. People can feel patronized by that. But the idea is that responding in a way that actually shows and affirms, I understand what you've just said to me. I'm understanding your message rather than sort of just like, okay, good, and moving on. That's not a very affirming way of listening. All of us can do that, by the way, including this guy. So it's stuff we have to take action steps to work on. Any other examples? Yeah, excellent. Excellent. Yeah, so just building our wives up and helping them recognize ways that God has especially gifted them and that they have a really important role to play in the life of other people and of the church. That's excellent. Also, one of the ways we can nourish each other's faith is not only by promoting what is good, but also by helping to discourage what is unhelpful. There have been times, and Mary Grace wouldn't mind me sharing, there's times where she's maybe been reading certain books or certain blogs that I have really clearly noticed are just bringing her down. They're just making her feel like she's not enough, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing that, and all this kind of stuff. And I've just kind of come alongside and not been like, I forbid you to do that. That's not very helpful. If necessary, okay, fine, but there's usually some other ways you can approach it, and you can start by going, honey, I'm not sure this is edifying for you. I've been noticing this seems to be drawing you away from the Lord rather than helping you grow up in the Lord. And starting a conversation and maybe helping to encourage her away from things that are going to detract from her faith and bring her down. Also, sometimes for people, certain music, certain movies, certain hobbies, certain habits, certain friends. There's lots of influences that sometimes, for some of us, can be negative and pulling us away from the Lord. And part of nourishing a person's faith is not only giving, just like a good diet, it's not just eating the right things, it's also not eating the bad things. A plate full of carrots followed by a plate full of cake is not very helpful. So you need to be able to rightly address both. All right. Mm-hmm.
Isn't there a risk for husbands to nourish their wives or if they grow in the Lord? Because the more the wife knows about what a husband's supposed to do, the more at risk he is.
Yes, that's right, which is part of the health of this class. And starting with husbands. Even though Ephesians starts with the wife, I think it's important for us to start with the husbands because you have been called to lead. And being made aware, having this taught to you, having this taught to your spouse is very helpful to create some accountability and expectations. John.
This is probably not unique to too many families, but we have extended family issues on both sides of the family that are very toxic. So we learn to protect each other from God. We're very active.
Yeah,
It's been very helpful for both of us.
that's really good. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. On next bullet point here of number 3, top of page 71, the author provides several examples of ways that a husband can and should nourish his wife's faith. List them all below, and then pick at least 2 which you recognize a need to grow in as a husband. So, what are some of the ones you have listed here? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, love is one of the ones the author listed. What are some of the other ones? Yes, by his prayer life. What are some others? Patience? Yes. So, Jordan, I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. Hope you don't mind. That is definitely one of the ones he listed. So, how does your meditation on God's Word nourish Kenna's faith? How does your meditation bless her in your marriage? So, sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of the old adage that you can't give other people what you don't have. You cannot be a very helpful, Christ-like spiritual leader when you yourself are very immature in the faith and unknowledgeable of the Word. When the Word isn't governing your heart, it certainly isn't going to enable you to then effectively share that in your leadership in the family. And so a man's meditation on the Word, among these other things we've also listed, is very important. What are some of the other ones he listed?
Go back to that one just a minute.
Yeah.
For us, it does work both ways. I've been blessed so many times by something Kendra read or saw or heard, and vice versa. And it get shared, not in any formal setting, but whenever, you're walking with someone, whenever it comes out, it becomes a blessing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's likewise in my marriage. There's been several times that Mary's meditation on the Word has encouraged me also. Yeah. He also lists integrity. What is integrity? Yeah. Yeah, and you might say even integrity is revealed in who you are when you think no one is watching. When you're out in public, it's easy for any of us at some level to put on something of a performance. But when you think you're all alone, when you don't think there's any accountability, when nobody's watching you, who are you? What do you love? What do you look at? How do you speak? How do you act? How do you treat your wife? How do you treat your children? That's integrity. And a man who's lacking integrity cannot hope to think he is being a Christ-like leader in the home. Those two things are not compatible. You can't lack integrity and be Christ-like in your leadership. Another he listed is commitment to his church. Obviously, you are all here on Sunday afternoon, so I recognize that that's something you value in your life, but it's worth stating that it's very important. People like to push back against being members of a church or participating in church activities. They like to push back and say, I don't have to do that to be a Christian. I can, just between me and the Lord privately. I understand what they're getting at. But I'll tell you that as a pastor, the number one sign that a person is fading spiritually and backsliding is that they stop showing up to church. Think whatever you want about saying you don't need to come. I'm telling you, when I start seeing you absent, I promise you, something bad is starting up in your life. It happens every time. So even when we don't feel like we want it or even feel like we need it, maybe it's a good thing for us to just say, you know what, it's a settled issue for our family. We're going to be committed. Whether it's a season where we feel like we're thriving or whether it's a season we feel like we're dragging. We're going to show up and keep putting ourselves beneath, so to speak, the fountain of God's kindness and grace to us in those ministries. Also, his care for his family. So there's several things listed here, and they're good, helpful, practical examples. And I encouraged you, men, to pick two of them to really kind of circle and potentially try to implement in your life. For me, those two that come to mind would be increasing my time of prayer for my family and for myself, and also being more patient in my leadership. Those are the two on this list that stick out most for me. And so for me, those are the things I'm going to tuck away and go, okay, this coming week, I want to really try to consciously think about how can I do a better job in these ways. I hope that you'll do the same with some that stick out for you. Now, the next section called Unequally Yoked. Let me read the introduction and we'll talk through the several components of it. In some marital situations, the two are not equally yoked. Either the husband or the wife may be an unbeliever or a very immature believer. This creates many special challenges to the health and vitality of a marriage. But such circumstances do not change the calling of either spouse before God. Even if the husband or wife is resistant to the nourishment of their spiritual life that we are trying to provide, we are still called to faithfully love them toward the Lord as best as we can. In question 4, I ask, how does the example from the elderly man's patient endurance in a spiritually divided marriage encourage you to be faithful and steadfast in your love for your spouse, despite their willingness to receive what you are offering them? First, who can recap in very brief form the story of this elderly man and how he related to his wife, some of the things he put up with? His wife was an unbeliever. What are some examples from the book? Yes. Yes, she hid his keys so he couldn't drive to church. She cut the buttons off his coat, as he pointed out. She just was ornery with this guy, and she just was trying everything she could to stifle his faith. And the author pointed out that while he certainly didn't like that and didn't approve of it, didn't agree with it, he just continued steadfastly to demonstrate to her how much he loved the Lord and was desirous of continuing to worship God. And so sometimes this man even walked to church when his keys to the car were hidden. And over the course of many years, so imagine this. I mean, put yourself in this situation. This is going to tick you off. I mean, you're going to just be like, what is going on here? This is outrageous, But he didn't throw in the towel. He didn't try to exaggerate his suffering so much as to give himself an excuse to get out of the marriage. Instead, he saw it as his responsibility to continue to do the best he could, surely imperfectly, but to do the best he could to be a faithful husband to his wife. And in the end, while this does not always happen, in the end, that man led his wife to Christ from his sickbed. And then she died before him. And he rejoiced to know that despite all the years of trials that he had walked through, he would now share the relationship with God and eternity with her by his side. And I think that's a truly amazing and inspiring story, not because it's going to be the outcome for all of us, but because it helps us start to think, okay, how should this encourage us? This is a good example. How should this encourage us if we find ourselves in a relationship right now in our marriage that is maybe not unequally yoked, or maybe it is, but it's one where you're not on the same page? How does this man's example encourage us? What does this example call us to do? Yes, praying for the other person. Yeah.
On the personal side, it's been quite a few years. I go, and we going through patches. 36 years, you don't end up there all looking good. Your gut is scraped, a little damaged, but I go back to the vows I took. I took those before the Lord, and there's a commitment section in there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's honoring the commitment that I made when I told her father I would take her hand and take care of her. And that doesn't always come up when we're in arguments, especially with me, because I'm very selfish. But try to reflect back on that, realize the gift I was given.
Yeah, and you brought something out there that I think is so important. You said, the vows I took before the Lord. Part of the problem with marriage today is that it has been completely secularized. People don't realize your vow wasn't to that person. Your vow was to God. That person may change, but God hasn't. And so that person's highs and lows don't change your commitment. You have committed to the Lord. And that alone will help see a person through times where the person that they vowed to love is not fulfilling their desires. It's not a time where they're feeling very pleased or happy in the marriage. The fact that their commitment is more vertical than horizontal will strengthen us to face those hard seasons and to keep fighting to persevere. Yes, Ron.
Although in our example that we're given here, the husband was the target of the anger or resentment of the wife. The real battle was between the wife and God,
Mm.
and she saw God in the husband, but he was the target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Very good point. And I think this story also reminds us not to lose hope. Sorry, Will.
I was just going to say that in a sense, I think before we know Christ, we are all unequally yoked with God in heaven. So, we are against him, and he has pursued us. We were the wife that hid the key and that cut the button in a sense. And God continues to put people and opportunity in our path to chase us down.
Yeah.
And to draw us to him. So I think we've all got individuals in our life that do not know Christ, that maybe even hate our walk with Christ. And maybe they don't say it so verbally, but their actions and attitudes do. And our love can penetrate that, but it's really God, it's the Holy Spirit working through us in the patience with those individuals.
Yeah. So remembering how God has loved us when we have been rebellious to him can maybe help us continue to love our spouse in those times. On page 18, question 5, have you ever experienced a sense of distance forming between you and your spouse? What characteristics did you start to notice about the marriage when you have felt this way? And I asked you to list them. What are some of the things on the list here? So, less conversations.
Less conversation, tolerate each other instead of loving each other. There's no really emotion, mechanical. And even the dialogue that you do have, in my case, is short, specific answers. And Again, I can go on and on here.
Yeah. No, this is helpful because there are a lot of people whose marriages are basically platonic. They haven't divorced each other, but they live as though they're already divorced. They live as though they're no longer united in a bond of marriage. And honestly, that's a very sad thing. And so it's important for us to talk through some of this. What are some other examples? What kinds of behaviors start to happen in a marriage when that marriage is growing apart or people are experiencing distance? Yes, spend more time at work. What about more screen time? Whether it's a TV or a phone or a computer, you come home, husbands do this a lot, I hear. They come home from work and they just sit in front of the TV for hours, or they're on their phone, or they're on their iPad, or things like that. And again, there's nothing wrong with enjoying those things in an appropriate way, but what I'm talking about here is allowing those things to be used in a manner of being distant from your spouse. What about just more time apart in general? Work was a way, but it's not only work, right? Sometimes it's guys going out to do other hobbies or taking on extra work that they don't need and other kinds of things. You also experience less physical intimacy. One of the things, and you always want to be careful here because people's marriages and the dynamics of their marriage are not always going to be identical. But as an example that may or may not perfectly apply, you'll still get the principle. When people start growing more and more comfortable not sleeping in the same room, and not because somebody is this atrocious snorer, but because they're just distancing themselves from each other, and they're getting more and more comfortable with that, that's usually a sign that things are trending in a very, very bad direction for that marriage. Again, there are sometimes medical reasons that may be needed, but you understand the principle I'm getting at. Also,
On a smaller scale to that, even when a husband and wife are together in the same room, if they're having issues, there's going to be reduced eye contact,
mm-hmm.
reduced just touching.
Yes.
Not necessarily anything more than that, but just because there's going to be more physical separation.
Yes, absolutely. Also, replacement of relational intimacy by other people or other activities. People will find other things to try to fill their needs. And so, next bullet point here, what do you believe caused one or both of you to begin feeling and or acting this way in times when this has happened in your marriage? I think that's a very big one. Selfishness is huge. You're not doing what I want you to do, so I'm going to treat you this way. That's a despicable, un-Christ-like attitude, and yet it's one that I think all of us, if we're honest, would say, yeah, that's been in my heart sometimes. What are some others? What about unforgiveness? I think I heard somebody's voice. Did I cut somebody off? Elva? Yeah. Yeah, so unforgiveness, holding on to things. Jordan? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so passivity, right? Just passivity can lead to this as well. Just like a garden, you don't have to try to grow weeds. They grow all by themselves if you just leave it alone, right? Yeah. Pride, yes. Hmm. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, pride. Yeah.
Go put the kids to bed. I'm going to be by myself.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff. And I think, as you go through that really exhausting season of life, I think it has a tendency to kind of draw couples apart because she's tired, he's tired, and
Mm-hmm. Other things that create distance is unfaithfulness. in a marriage. And that does not always mean the full extent of committing adultery or entering into some kind of inappropriate emotional relationship. But even when a husband is beginning to just show interest in other people, or privately, secretly indulge in pornography, or pursue other kinds of things, all of that are degrees of unfaithfulness. And a man is really self-deceived if he thinks he can entertain that in one part of his life and it not affect his relationship with his wife. It absolutely will. If in the smallest way you won't be able to look her in the eye, and you're going to feel shame, and that will have an impact on your relationship. Also, being secretive with each other. Hiding things from your spouse is wrong. You can argue with me all day that you don't think that. That's fine. We can agree to disagree. I'm a pastor. My responsibility is to tell you the best I can what I think is right. Hiding things from your spouse is wrong, and it invites suspicion, and it tells them that you have something to hide. So behaving that way is not the appropriate way to exercise headship and to claim, well, as the leader, I'm allowed to do this, or whatever other excuses. It creates all kinds of detrimental things in a marriage. There's other examples of this as well, but let's press forward to question 6. The author provided a much-needed statement of wisdom concerning this experience when he said, quote, "We may still be tempted to shut our spouses out of our deepest reflections because they do not process issues as we do. But our presumption should be that the companions God gave to complete us have contributions to make to our own growth. If we stifle those contributions or isolate ourselves from them, then we damage God's plan for our best life." In your own words, describe the counsel that the author is giving to you through the quote above. What's the message he wants us to take away from this?
Each one helps the other.
Yes.
I mean, I can't tell you how many times in our marriage where he'll bring something into a solution, trying to figure out the solution to something. And I never thought of it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I had shut her out, I never would have gotten that solution.
Yeah.
So that's a simple way of saying it works. It works all the time.
Yes.
And it's also trusting God's plan for your life.
Mm-hmm.
Like knowing that God does have a plan for your life and that His timing is perfect. My timing is not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
His timing.
Yeah. The words I put it, the way I put it was this: even when it is hard or our marriage relationship has greatly suffered, we are to believe that God has good things to bring into our life through our spouse. And therefore, we never stop opening up and we never stop investing. Until that marriage is terminated, you are committed, you are required to be committed to your spouse and to continue believing that God has good things for you in that marriage. And I want to add to this. This does not just mean that your spouse's strengths will help you. In God's sovereignty, even your spouse's weaknesses He will use to bless you. There are ways that Mary struggles that can be difficult for me as a husband, but I'm better in the long run for having to learn to love her through those things than I would have been if I never had to learn to love her through those things. And the same is true for her with me. Even her weaknesses and my weaknesses, when we try to approach them lovingly, God uses to actually help us and strengthen us and transform us to be more like Christ. That is absolutely true. Did you have something? Okay, just itching your ear? Sorry. I saw you out of the corner of my eye. I wasn't sure. All right, so let's skip question 7 for now because that's going to be our group discussion. And let's go over, we're just going to cover 8, 9, and 10, and then we'll wrap up for today. And we'll break into our groups. And question 8 on page 19 reads as follows. The author noted the particular danger of ungodly behavior in a husband, saying, if a man's heart wanders from God, his wife's longing to be close to him will make his waywardness a threat to her holiness. What potential consequence is the author pointing out through these words? What was he talking about here? Yeah, yeah, and I think what he's bringing out here, actually, Kent, I think you had something to share too.
Yeah, I wrote the wife's godliness can be a function of the husband, right? So if you're talking about taking responsibility, if you're leading your wife down a bad path and you're not being responsible for her spiritual growth, then you are contributing to her fault before God.
Yeah. Let me try to give an example. And again, this example is not meant to be taken as anything universal for every person, but just to put some illustration to it, okay? So let's imagine there's a marriage and the husband is not behaving in a very godly way. He's going and spending his time at bars. He's just going and kind of hanging with the guys. And his wife is feeling distance in that marriage. She doesn't want that life, but she also loves her husband. She wants her husband's love. She wants his attention. What decision is before her? Either I keep the distance between me and my husband, or I go with him into his sin. Do you see the tension? And here's the reality. As husbands, if we are not being godly in our example, we are putting temptation before our bride for her to feel, if I want my husband's attention, if I want his love, then I'm going to have to go and love what he loves and do what he does. Otherwise, I'll have to just do without what my heart craves from him. Does that make sense? And that's what the author's bringing out. And headship, Christ-like headship, would never want to intentionally put their spouse in such a situation. You would never want to lead in a way that would say, honey, if you want my love and my attention, then you're going to have to follow me into sin. You're going to have to follow me into ungodly behavior or worldly living or even inappropriate sexual interactions. And those kinds of pressures exist, and we have to be careful about them. Number 9, this same principle that a wife might be tempted to follow her husband into sin, this same principle is also true in reverse. A husband's actions and words can incite sin in their wife's heart, but the husband's actions and words can also promote her holiness. After all, the man, quote, the man tends to set the spiritual tone of the family. Husbands, and wives, what are examples of ways a husband can positively influence the spiritual health of his family? What are some things that come to mind? I've got some examples I can give, but I would love to hear from you. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a very commendable thing. And you're not alone in those not always being awesome. The same is true in my home. Not every time we sit down for family worship does it feel like the Holy Spirit has visited on high. Sometimes we think, well, okay, hopefully these seeds will grow, but we're not really sure. And that's okay. Sometimes the kids are crying or we're exhausted. But that's life. That's us still following God even when life isn't easy or isn't the most ideal for those situations. That's a great example. What are some others? Yeah.
Well, no matter what the day is like, how busy our household is, we'll always makes it a point to lead us in family prayer time before bed, and we just go around, say what we're grateful for, thankful for, whatever's on our heart.
Yeah.
No matter what happens, he always leads us.
That's fantastic. What about when you, and this could be with your kids or it could be with just your spouse. Have you ever come home and your spouse is just in a really sour mood? They're just ticked off, they're frustrated, annoyed, and they're being very negative. How do you help in that situation? How can you positively influence the spiritual health of the family there?
Well, I had down, and I think it's in the same vein, is how can the husband help? It's how he deals with pain. And to your point, do integrity, right? How you behave when no one's looking or when you're in your safe spot or whatever says everything about you. But, the way you witness to your family is, in one way, is how you deal with the things that hurt. It's easy to be good when things are good. Sure. But
Yeah.
especially when things are bad.
Yeah, and sometimes, thank you for that. And sometimes, like I'll just give you an example from my life. With my kids or with Mary, there are times where just negative culture has come in, where, the kids are, oh, I'm annoyed, stop doing that and stop doing this. And, you took my toy and da-da-da-da. And I have an opportunity there. It doesn't feel like an opportunity, but it is one. I have an opportunity to exercise influence. And that influence can either be, my bark is louder than yours, and I'm in charge, so I'm going to drop the hammer on you guys and make you shut up in the same mean spirit that you're showing. Or I can enter into that dialogue and begin to model for them a new kind of problem solving or a new kind of conversation or change the tone of how we're relating. We have opportunities in those moments. This is not because of my wife, but just given the conversation here, if Mary's having a rough day and everything just looks bad, this isn't working, and that isn't working, and this isn't working, I can either join her in the complaining fest, which will only promote negativity for her and just further discouragement, or the anxiety fest, or whatever it is, the worry. Or I can try to come alongside her very gently, not in a patronizing way of like, you should be joyful in the Lord, honey. Like, that may not be the best approach. Maybe it is, but kind of come alongside her and just help her calm down a little bit and comfort her and say, hey, it's okay. We're going to solve this. I'm with you. You're not alone in these problems. We're going to face these things together, and God is going to help us. And gently starting to help steer the conversation away from doubt and fear and frustration toward faith and hope and love and joy. That's the kinds of things that husbands should be thinking about as the leader in the family. Not drop the hammer, shut up and stop it, all that kind of, you're literally modeling for them the same bad behavior you're trying to get them to stop doing. So when they keep doing it, just so you know, you're to blame. They're just following your example. But instead, actually modeling Christ-like leadership. And when you fail to do that, like this guy does sometimes and says, just cut it out, going back sometimes and saying, you know what, I didn't handle that well. Would you please forgive me? I needed to address you, but I shouldn't have addressed you like that. I apologize to my children and to my wife with some frequency. When I make mistakes, I want to go back to them and say, hey, that wasn't the right way for me to handle that. Will you forgive me? Even that is an opportunity to exercise some influence that can help model Christian values, Christian beliefs, Christian practice in the home. Final question, question 10. When, and you'll notice this question begins with when. Not do you, not if, but actually when. When do you set aside time to pray and read the Bible together as a family? What is your plan for maintaining this critical aspect of godly leadership in the home? I know that is an unusual practice for even many Christians, but it is an indispensable practice for the head of the home who wants to lead with a Christ-like leadership. The Word, and even more importantly, the God of the Word, should be at the center of the family's life. That doesn't mean an hour-long Bible study every night or anything like that. It may be a 5-minute window. It may be a 10-minute window or 20-minute window. But it's a time daily with sort of asterisk there of like, hey, life happens. We all understand. But that you endeavor to daily put God at the center of your family's mind and heart and in the center of your home. When do you do that, men? And we don't necessarily need to answer that question now as much as I just want to put that question to you. How are you doing that with your wife? It may be that pick a book of the Bible and start with a small one. Pick 1 John or something like that and say, honey, would it be okay if we just read a little chunk of this together and took a few minutes to pray for each other each day? Maybe you don't even offer that many comments. Maybe that feels very uncomfortable for you, and that's okay. But even just reading the Word and praying might be a great starting place for you two to cultivate this together and for you as the husband to be attempting, by faith, to lead your family in this kind of thing. Does that make sense? So I just want to encourage that in you. And when you fall off the horse, dust yourself off and get back on. We all have fallen off, and I will fall off many more times before the Lord takes me to glory, most likely. But get back up and ask God, okay, help me to do this again. I've let things distract us. I've let our priorities get off, but I want to bring them back and recenter them again. All right, so we've covered quite a few things. I'm going to leave the remaining questions off for today, but for our group discussion with our remaining time, look at question 7 with me. It's on page 18. I want to read through this and kind of explain the heart of this question, and then we'll break up into groups for some discussion time. The question reads, the author used a story from his own life to describe the way he can sometimes promote sin in his wife by venting his frustrations to her in a way that leads her to struggle. He noted that different couples may face this dynamic in different ways, saying, other husbands may require different sacrifices to shield their wives from temptations. A woman who is particularly prone to worry or gossip or jealousy benefits from a husband who will express concerns in ways that do not engender inappropriate reactions in his wife's heart. So the example in the book, because I think this is a very important thing for us to think about. And this goes both ways, by the way. We're just, the reason it's from husband to wife here is because we're in the section on husbands. But this goes both ways, from wives to husbands as well. But the example he gave is that sometimes when he's frustrated or angry, he wants his wife to feel angry too, because it comforts him. He's like, yeah, that's right. See, it's their fault. Don't you? You know what that's like. We all feel that. We want sympathy. We want support from our spouse. But he pointed out how if I have a problem over here with this person, I bring that home and vent it to my wife. I later get to go and have reconciliation happen with that person. Things get smoothed over and we work it out. While she's stuck here with only hearing about how bad it was and how upsetting they were, and that can leave her with bitterness and frustration. You can understand that dynamic, right? The same can be true with so many things, with worry. I'm shooting off the hip here, but if you come home from work someday and things are difficult at your job, it may be bad enough you need to tell your wife about it. I'm not saying to hide things from her that she needs to know, but it may be that you don't need to tell her about the uncertainties that you're facing just yet. Because you telling her may just leave her, if she's prone to worry, with anxiety and fear and stress and all this stuff that she may not even need to ever deal with. Does that make sense? Same with anxiety, same with gossip, same with slander, same with jealousy. There are certain things you need to know your spouse. And again, this goes both ways. You need to know your spouse and be thoughtful about how can I relate with them and converse with them in a way that does not unintentionally gather a bunch of fuel around the fire of their sin and then wave at it to get it to catch. Does that make sense? So what I want us to do as we break up into groups is, husbands, you know your wife well. To what sins is she particularly prone? And wives, to be honest with yourselves, which sins are you particularly prone? Don't worry, we're going to get to wives later, and we'll get to talk about some of the husband struggles. So if you're feeling like, well, this feels a little one-sided, we'll get there, okay? But I want you to be honest with each other. Wives, be real. What is it that you might be prone to that you would say, you know what, I have to be careful when it comes to things like this? And husbands, you can share very respectfully what you've recognized. And then the final bit is to think about this. Being prone to these sins, how might a husband guard his actions and words from unintentionally promoting these struggles in his wife's life? Does that make sense? We want to be thoughtful about how do I lead in a way that doesn't encourage sin in my spouse. Everybody tracking with that? Awesome. So let's break up. We've got about 15 minutes until I'll close us in prayer, and I want the groups to share with each other. Again, guys with guys.